The right to challenge the assumption that Western academic institutions are neutral referees of African history. The central issue is not that every Western scholar deliberately falsifies evidence. It is that the institutions empowered to define evidence, expertise, civilization, literacy, chronology, and historical significance were largely created or financed by societies that enslaved, colonized, looted, and economically subordinated African peoples. That power shaped which questions were asked, whose testimony counted, which objects were removed from their communities, and which conclusions were described as established, controversial, or Afrocentric. The more honest starting point, Africa was not a peripheral recipient of civilization. Africa was the birthplace of humanity. It's one of the earliest centers of technological development. It's also home to multiple independent agricultural, metallurgical, political, commercial, philosophical, religious, architectural, and scholarly traditions. A major participant in Mediterranean, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, Saharan, Atlantic, and global systems, and a foundational contributor to the wealth and development of Europe and the Americas. UNESCO's General History of Africa was launched specifically because African history had long been written through racial prejudice generated by slavery and colonialism. Its purpose was to reconstruct African history from African perspectives, using African scholars, archaeology, oral traditions, manuscripts, linguistics, and indigenous knowledge systems, not merely colonial archives. More than 550 African and international experts have contributed to the project. That fact itself is revealing. An enormous international undertaking was required to correct what had been normalized as universal history. Western knowledge was never detached from Western power. European descriptions of Africa were not produced in an innocent intellectual vacuum. They developed alongside the Atlantic trafficking of African human beings, plantation slavery, imperial conquest, missionary expansion, resource extraction, scientific racism, museum collecting through warfare and coercion, and colonial education systems. African scholars associated with institutions such as Codisria argue that Eurocentrism did more than misunderstand Africa. It positioned Western categories of knowledge as universal while relegating African knowledge to folklore, superstition, or primitivism. This allowed progressive ideas to be credited to Western civilization, while African intellectual production was denied, detached from its creators, or treated as derivative. Therefore, the dispute is not simply African scholars say one thing, while objective Western scholars remain unconvinced. The deeper question is, who obtained the institutional authority to decide which civilization was intelligent enough to produce history in the first place? How colonial historiography worked. Colonial historiography relied upon several mutually reinforcing practices. 1. Africa was portrayed as having no history. Because many African societies transmitted knowledge orally, European historians often claimed they possessed no usable historical record. This was intellectually dishonest. European history itself depends on oral testimony, legends and epics, material remains, coins, inscriptions, linguistic evidence, religious texts, retrospective chronicles, and archaeology. Yet oral history was frequently rejected when African communities used it. African historical schools in Ibadan, Dakar, Dar es Salaam, and Maputo helped establish rigorous methods for integrating oral tradition with archaeology, linguistics, anthropology, and documentary evidence. This work overturned major elements of colonial historiography. 1. African achievements were attributed to outsiders. When colonial explorers encountered sophisticated African cities, monuments, artworks, or political institutions, they often assumed Africans could not have created them. Great Zimbabwe is a defining example. European writers attributed the complex to Phoenicians, Arabs, biblical figures, or other outsiders. These explanations were not driven by superior evidence. They were driven by a racial premise. Black Africans could not have built an advanced stone city. Archaeology firmly identifies Great Zimbabwe as the creation of local African societies. Even the British Museum now describes it as one of Southern Africa's most important historic urban centers. The original debate was therefore not an equal contest between two reasonable interpretations. One side began with material evidence, the other began with white supremacy. 1. African objects were admired while African intelligence was denied. European powers collected, often stole, African artworks while simultaneously describing Africans as culturally inferior. The Benin bronzes reveal this contradiction with extraordinary clarity. Their technical complexity, historical detail, political symbolism, and artistic mastery contradicted the European image of a primitive Africa. Britain nevertheless invaded Benin City in 1897, removed thousands of royal and sacred objects, burned parts of the city, and distributed the looted works through museums and private collections. The British Museum itself acknowledges that its Benin objects were looted during the 1897 military expedition. Western institutions could therefore display African genius while separating that genius from African sovereignty. The objects became world heritage once Europeans possessed them, although the people who created them had supposedly lacked civilization. 1. Egypt was conceptually removed from Africa. Ancient Egypt is geographically African. Its civilization arose in the Nile Valley through long interaction with Nubia, the Sahara, the Levant, the Mediterranean, and other regions. Nevertheless, Western popular history often treats Egypt as Mediterranean, but not African, Middle Eastern, but not African, universal, but not African, or mysteriously detached from the continent beneath it. This conceptual removal serves an ideological purpose. Egypt can be celebrated as a foundational civilization only after its African identity is weakened. There are legitimate scholarly debates over migration, language, population relationships, ethnicity, and cultural exchange in different Egyptian periods. But the existence of such debates does not justify presenting Egypt as culturally isolated from Africa. The Nile flowed through African territories, and Egypt's long relationship with Nubia, Kush, Punt, and the interior cannot be erased merely because its civilization complicates modern racial categories. 1. African complexity was divided into isolated exceptions. When African achievements became impossible to deny, they were often treated as disconnected exceptions. Egypt was separated from Black Africa. Carthage was assigned entirely to Phoenician history. Aksum was treated mainly through Christianity and the Red Sea. North Africa was detached from the rest of Africa. Swahili civilization was attributed primarily to Arabs or Persians. Great Zimbabwe was initially credited to foreigners. Timbuktu was reduced to legend. Benin art was admired without recognizing the political system that produced it. The cumulative effect was to prevent people from seeing a continent filled with interconnected civilizations. What Western civilization has to lose? Western societies do not lose their genuine achievements when African history is restored. Europeans still developed major traditions in philosophy, science, statecraft, literature, navigation, and technology. What is lost is something different. The mythology of exclusive authorship. The myth that Europe created civilization largely by itself. Western civilization is commonly narrated as a straight line: Greece, Rome, Christian Europe, Renaissance, Enlightenment, modernity. That sequence conceals the intellectual traffic connecting Europe with Egypt and Nubia, North Africa, the Levant, Mesopotamia, the Islamic world, African trade networks, and the wider Indian Ocean world. Knowledge did not move in one direction. Mediterranean civilizations borrowed, translated, adapted, competed, intermarried, conquered, and learned from one another. Recognizing this does not erase Greece or Rome. It places them inside the interconnected world in which they actually existed. The moral defense of slavery and colonialism. European imperial powers claimed they were bringing civilization to societies that lacked it. But what happens to that defense when the colonized societies already possessed? States, diplomatic systems, commercial law, universities and scholarly networks, metallurgical industries, urban centers, architecture, medicine, agriculture, artistic schools, spiritual systems, and sophisticated political traditions. The civilizing mission is then exposed not as benevolence, but as propaganda masking conquest and extraction. The African Union identifies liberation from colonialism, apartheid, racism, and external domination as central to the Pan-African project, because these were not merely past political arrangements. They shaped the continent's institutions, borders, economies, and global representation. The legitimacy of accumulated Western wealth. Europe and the Americas did not simply advance while Africa mysteriously failed to develop. Western accumulation was connected to enslaved African labor, African gold, ivory, rubber, palm oil, diamonds, copper, uranium, petroleum, cocoa, strategic minerals, land seizures, coercive taxation, forced labor, and unequal trading relationships. Restoring African history makes it harder to portray modern Western wealth as the product of isolated merit and African poverty as the result of isolated African failure. It forces a causal question. How much Western development was financed through African dispossession? That question threatens national myths, corporate reputations, museum collections, inheritance, geopolitical arrangements, and resistance to reparative justice. The intellectual hierarchy underlying racism. Racial domination required more than weapons. It required a story. That story claimed that Africans were ahistorical, irrational, incapable of self-government, technologically stagnant, intellectually dependent, and naturally suited for enslavement or colonial supervision. If African civilizations are recognized as producers of philosophy, science, administration, agriculture, mathematics, art, urbanism, law, and international commerce, then racial hierarchy becomes visibly political rather than natural. This is why African intelligence was not merely overlooked. It frequently had to be actively denied. Control over museums and cultural authority. Western museums possess vast numbers of African objects acquired during colonial conquest, punitive expeditions, missionary campaigns, archaeological removals, and unequal transactions. These institutions gained prestige, research authority, tourism income, cultural capital, and the power to interpret Africa to the world. Restitution debates are therefore not simply about returning beautiful objects. They concern who owns history and who has the authority to explain it. The contradiction is stark. Western museums used African creations to establish themselves as universal repositories of civilization, while Western narratives denied that Africans had produced civilization. Debated does not always mean genuinely uncertain. You are also correct that the word debated can conceal unequal power. Some claims are debated because the evidence is genuinely incomplete. That is normal scholarship. Other claims became debates because accepting the evidence would disrupt an established racial or institutional narrative. There is a meaningful difference between uncertainty caused by incomplete archaeological evidence, disagreement over the interpretation of complex evidence, and refusal to accept African achievement because it contradicts an ideological expectation. Great Zimbabwe demonstrates the third category. African authorship was resisted not because foreign authorship had stronger evidence, but because colonial ideology had predetermined what Africans were supposedly capable of doing. However, intellectual decolonization should not require accepting every counterclaim simply because it opposes Western scholarship. African-centered history is strongest when it combines African oral traditions, local languages, archaeology, manuscripts, genetics, environmental evidence, material culture, and critical examination of both African and non-African sources. The objective is not to replace the mythology of European supremacy with unsupported mythology. It is to end the presumption that Europe is naturally the author, judge, and owner of human advancement. A truthful history begins with several propositions. Africa is not merely where humanity began before real history moved elsewhere. Africa remained a center of human innovation throughout history. Its peoples created technologies, domesticated crops, developed pastoral systems, shaped Mediterranean and Indian Ocean commerce, established kingdoms, federations, empires, and city-states, advanced iron, copper, gold, brass, and steel production, built international centers of scholarship, developed systems of law, diplomacy, taxation, and public administration, resisted slavery and colonialism, transformed the cultures of the Americas through forced migration, and continued to influence global music, language, religion, cuisine, political thought, science, literature, and art. African civilization is not important merely because it may have influenced the West. That formulation still makes the West the measure of significance. African civilizations matter because they were complete human societies with their own purposes, achievements, contradictions, intellectual traditions, and historical agency. The map is part of the same problem. Africa covers approximately 30.3 million square kilometers and is the world's second largest continent. The Mercator projection enlarges land near the poles while reducing the apparent relative size of equatorial regions. Its original navigational purpose explains the mathematical distortion, but it does not explain why the projection remained culturally dominant in classrooms and public imagery long after more appropriate world maps became available. Africa appears far smaller than it is, while Europe, Greenland, and northern countries appear disproportionately large. That visual distortion reinforces an ideological geography. The global north looks dominant. Europe appears larger and more central. Africa appears smaller, fragmented, and peripheral. The map did not create colonialism by itself, but generations repeatedly seeing Europe enlarged and Africa reduced helped naturalize a world hierarchy already promoted through politics, education, religion, museums, and racial ideology. Western civilization has not historically feared African inclusion because African history would somehow make Europe worthless. It has feared African inclusion because it destroys the claim that Europe's dominance proves Europe's inherent superiority. Once Africa is restored to history, conquest no longer looks like civilization. Looting no longer looks like collecting. Exploitation no longer looks like development. Slavery no longer looks incidental to Western prosperity. Colonial archives no longer look neutral, and European global dominance no longer looks like the inevitable victory of the world's most intelligent people. The deepest truth is this: Africa was not excluded from the Western historical narrative because Africa lacked history. Africa was excluded because the history it possessed contradicted the racial, economic, and moral story that Western power needed to tell about itself. Discuss the Western scholars that traveled to the countries of Africa to study, then used that knowledge and took credit for the information taught to them by the people in those African countries. There are documented cases where European scholars, explorers, missionaries, and colonial officials learned from African teachers, translators, artisans, physicians, and scholars, but gave them little or no credit in published works. At the same time, it would not be historically accurate to say that Western scholars broadly took credit for all knowledge they encountered in Africa. The historical record shows a spectrum, from genuine collaboration to appropriation and erasure. Perhaps the oldest and most debated question concerns the relationship between Greek intellectuals and Egypt. Ancient Greek writers themselves reported traveling to Egypt to study. Among those associated with Egypt are Solon, Pythagoras, Plato, Herodotus. For example, Herodotus described Egypt as an ancient and highly learned civilization whose customs influenced others. The more difficult question is how much Greek philosophy, mathematics, and science were directly derived from Egyptian knowledge. Some African-centered scholars, including Cheikh Anta Diop and George G. M. James, argued that Greek philosophy borrowed extensively from Egyptian intellectual traditions. Many mainstream historians agree there was significant contact and exchange, but argue that the evidence does not support the conclusion that Greek philosophy was simply copied from Egypt. Much of the original Egyptian scholarly record has been lost, making precise attribution difficult. What is not disputed is that Egypt was already a sophisticated civilization, with mathematics, medicine, engineering, astronomy, and writing, long before classical Greece emerged. Between the 14th and 16th centuries, Timbuktu was one of the world's major centers of learning. Its scholars wrote on astronomy, law, medicine, mathematics, theology, commerce. For centuries, many European writers either ignored or doubted the existence of these scholarly traditions. When French colonial authorities later encountered the manuscript collections, they often treated them as discoveries rather than recognizing that local families had preserved them for generations, frequently at great personal risk. Modern projects led by Malian scholars have worked to preserve and study these manuscripts while restoring recognition to the communities that safeguarded them. European travelers and colonial physicians frequently learned from African healers. Examples include knowledge of medicinal plants, treatments for tropical diseases, wound care, obstetrics, poisonous, and medicinal herbs. Colonial scientific publications often incorporated botanical or medical information while recording only Latin scientific names or European collectors, rather than the African practitioners who had identified and used these plants for generations. This pattern was not unique to Africa. It also occurred in the Americas and Asia. European settlers in southern Africa learned extensively from Khoisan and other African peoples about local ecology, tracking animal behavior, edible plants, water sources, survival in arid environments. European explorers later published guides and reports that often emphasized their own discoveries while minimizing the indigenous expertise that made those expeditions possible. During the 19th century, explorers including John Hanning Speke and Richard Francis Burton relied heavily on African guides, interpreters, porters, and local rulers. Much of the geographical information they recorded had already been known to local communities. European publications nevertheless tended to present these journeys as discoveries from a European perspective, because they were introducing the information to European audiences, not because Africans had only then become aware of it. Many historians today note that this language obscures the essential role of African knowledge and assistance. When Europeans encountered Great Zimbabwe, many refused to believe that Africans had built it. Instead, they proposed origins involving Phoenicians, Arabs, biblical figures, other foreign civilizations. The issue here was not that Europeans claimed to have built it themselves, but that they denied African authorship altogether. Archaeological evidence has since firmly established that Great Zimbabwe was built by local African societies. When British forces invaded the Kingdom of Benin in 1897, they seized thousands of bronze, brass, and ivory works. European experts admired their sophistication, but initially questioned whether Africans could have produced them independently. As research progressed, those assumptions were overturned, and the bronzes are now recognized as products of highly skilled Edo artists. Missionaries and linguists often depended on African teachers to learn local languages, produce dictionaries, translate religious texts, document oral traditions. The resulting publications frequently highlighted the European compiler, while giving little attention to the African collaborators whose linguistic expertise made the work possible. Modern linguistic scholarship increasingly seeks to identify and credit those contributors. Several structural factors contributed. European academic publishing generally credited the lead author rather than local collaborators. Colonial attitudes often viewed African assistants as informants rather than intellectual partners. Oral knowledge was frequently considered less authoritative than written European documentation. Colonial power shaped who had access to universities, publishing, and international scholarly recognition. This pattern affected not only Africa, but also indigenous communities in Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. There is strong historical evidence that European scholars frequently learned from African experts. African teachers, guides, physicians, translators, artisans, and scholars often received little or no recognition. Colonial systems favored European names in publications and institutions. African intellectual traditions were frequently undervalued or dismissed. However, it would go beyond the available evidence to claim that all major Western scientific or philosophical achievements originated in Africa and were simply relabeled. The historical record supports extensive exchange, borrowing, collaboration, and, in many cases, appropriation or erasure, but the degree varies considerably depending on the individual, discipline, and period. One of the major goals of contemporary historical scholarship, including work led by African researchers and institutions, is to recover the identities and contributions of those African knowledge holders whose roles were minimized or omitted from earlier accounts.